After a slightly longer than expected hiatus, we're back with another episode of Critical History. So you thought we'd be discussing the 100 Years' War, didn't you? Well, sorry to disappoint you, because to talk about the 100 Years' War that lasted from 1337 to 1453, we have to first go over the background of the conflict. And to a large extent, the conflict can be traced back to the marriage of the King of England, Edward II, to a French princess, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair. Where have I heard that name before? Didn't he ban the Templars? That's right, he did. In fact, King Philip plays a rather prominent role in my book, Conquest of Truth. So if you're interested in a fictionalized account of his reign and the events of the time, including the arrest of the Templars, check it out. So back to Isabella. She was married at a young age to Edward II, famous these days for being the son of Edward Longshanks, and appearing in the Mel Gibson classic, Braveheart. No, not the guy who went flying through the window, the other one. And it seems that in 1314, when she was only 19 or 20, the wives of all three of Isabella's brothers, Louis, Philip, and Charles, were all accused of adultery. Apparently, by her. This became known as the Tour de Nesle affair, named after the tower where the sexual improprieties were said to have taken place. Were all three of the wives guilty of adultery, or only one or two? Who knows? But it seems Isabella was dead set on improving her own chances of becoming either queen or having her son, Edward III, named King of France. The knights who were accused of adultery? Well, if you're sensitive, it's time to cover your ears, because it's said they were castrated, flayed, broken on the wheel, and then hanged. Other historians argue they were merely castrated and then drawn and quartered. Now, usually the harshest tortures and punishments were reserved for those guilty of treason, so it makes me wonder if there's more to this story, or if the French crown was simply intent on setting a harsh precedent for committing adultery with a princess, because it would cast doubt on who truly fathered royal offspring. Alright, but what does this have to do with the 100 Years' War? Well, Philip the Fair died not long after the Tour de Nesle scandal, and his eldest son, Louis X, became king. But, get this, less than 2 years after being crowned, and after a particularly grueling game of tennis, Louis X collapsed and died. This is official history, folks. No, not murdered, not poisoned, a grueling game of tennis. Aged just 27. His son, born a few months later, was crowned but also died after just 5 days. The crown then passed to the second oldest son, Philip V. He managed to survive for about 5 or 6 years before he died from illness. Aged 29. Philip had 5 children with his wife Joan, who was said to have known about the Tour de Nesle affair but not committed adultery herself. The problem was, 4 of the 5 children were daughters, and the 5th, a son, died as an infant. So when Philip died, the crown this time passed to the youngest remaining brother, Charles IV. I'm not going to even get into how many of the royal offspring died during this period, between 1314 and 1328, but it was a lot. Charles also dies young, aged 33. Shocking, I know. I wasn't even able to find a cause of death for him. I guess that means it must have been natural causes. So this is where it all ties in to the start of the 100 Years' War. With the death of Philip IV and all 3 his sons, you might think that Philip's daughter, or her oldest son, Edward, would be next in line to the throne. Nope. Because it turns out the French decided they were going to abide by an ancient law known as the Salic Law, that a female descendant was not eligible to receive the crown. But Edward argued that didn't mean the crown couldn't be passed down the female line to a male descendant. Philip IV's nephew, meanwhile, thought all these deaths made him heir to the throne, and who ultimately ends up with the crown wasn't usually decided in a courtroom, it was decided on a battlefield. And he also had the advantage of having the support of the French nobility. Something I failed to mention is what I found interesting researching this time period was that the history of both Edward II, Edward III, and Roger Mortimer, who was regent in between them, as well as the Tour de Nesle affair, both stories have accounts of sleeping potions being used. In Roger Mortimer's case, sleeping potions were used to break him out of a tower and help him escape. And in the Tour de Nesle affair, there seems to be an account of some sort of drug-induced date rape. Which is just interesting because that's the earliest medieval accounts that I've found of, I guess, what we'd call sleeping potions or drug-induced sleep these days. So back to Philip VI. Philip becomes the King of France in 1328, aged 35, while his cousin, Edward, was just 15. To top it off, Edward was already King of England at this time, but this was in name only, as his mother had deposed his father and taken a new husband, Roger Mortimer. Remember, she was the one who accused everyone else of adultery, and the deposed king, Edward II, was the one who allegedly died from a red-hot poker. Now, how you die from a red-hot poker, I will leave to your imagination. So not only are the French and English royal families intermarried at this time, but you also have to remember that the English kings held territory on the continent, specifically in Gascony, which reminds me of the Basques. Gascony, Basques, Bascony. Another great example of word and place names changing ever so slightly over the centuries. Brittany was also controlled or under the influence of the French crown, and was referred to as Little Britain around this time. And it actually didn't end up being part of France for another 200 years. Another important fact to keep in mind is that Scotland was engaged in a war for independence against the English at this time as well, and they were in alliance with France. An interesting side note is that the Knights Templar were kicked out of France, but are alleged to have ended up in places like Switzerland and Scotland. So once Edward had negotiated a truce with the Scots, he was able to focus on waging war against the French. Both sides were searching for a pretext, a casus belli, and soon they had one. A French nobleman, Robert of Artois, had been exiled for forging a will that would give him the right to the county of Artois. He fled to Edward's court in England, but from the French perspective, he had been exiled. In 1337, when Edward refused to turn him over to the French crown, Philip VI seized the English territories in Aquitaine and Gascony. Bordeaux, in Gascony, with a population approaching 50,000, was at this time said to be a larger city than London and wealthier. It exported wine to England, and the English in return exported food, likely sheep, cattle, and grain. But just because the territories were seized de jure did not mean they were seized de facto. The use of cannon was not yet widespread, especially not in France and England, and the first accepted use of cannon for siege purposes in Western Europe is generally considered to have occurred in Metz only a decade earlier. If you want to know more about the development and use of early gunpowder as a weapon, I suggest you check out my book. It's still only available on Kindle or on an e-reader, but it should be available in print by the end of the year. I'm also just starting work on writing the sequel, so expect this channel to keep putting out videos, just at a slightly slower rate. So back to the 100 Years' War. The French king could claim Gascony, and he could raid Gascony, but taking Bordeaux by siege, that was a different matter. There's a famous saying that armchair generals discuss strategy and real generals discuss logistics. That should tell you just about everything you need to know about warfare at this time. There were not yet standing armies, and fighting only happened for a few weeks out of the year, when food was most plentiful. This led to the extensive use of chevauchés, mounted raids through enemy territory, designed merely to loot, pillage, take hostages, and send peasants scurrying for safety, destroying crops and causing your cities to become overcrowded in order to make the opposing king look powerless and ineffective, and increase social unrest. It seems for the first 8 years of the war, large battles and sieges were avoided in favor of these mounted raids. That all started to change in 1345 with the Battle of Oberroche. But it looks like we've run out of time. Check back next time where we discuss some of the major battles as well as the outcomes of this long-running war between England and France. We'll also discuss the mystery of Joan of Arc. How was she able to inspire the troops and turn the tide of the war in France's favor? Tune in next time to Critical History to find out. Now, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like, and leave a comment. Until then, you know what to do. Stay critical.